like I said, really appreciate the time here today,
Of course.
Jason. And just had a few questions for you here, sir, regarding chronic wasting disease. First, Jason, if you could first explain to our viewers what CWD is, how it is transmitted, and how it affects deer.
Sure. So CWD is a contagious infectious disease. It's 100% fatal to deer and other members of the deer family. It's caused by a misfolded protein, which is interesting. We tend to think of deer diseases as being caused by bacteria, virus, parasite, but this is actually a misfolded protein. It's transmitted either directly from deer to deer through deer to deer contact. It can also be transmitted from the environment if you have an infected deer, and it excretes those misfolded proteins while it's urinating or defecating, and other deer come into contact with those misfolded proteins when they're in the soil. It can be transmitted that way as well. The way it affects deer is the misfolded proteins enter the body of the deer. They cause other normal prion proteins to misfold, and then so it starts a chain reaction in the deer's body. So eventually, slowly through time, the infectious agent, the misfolded proteins, build up in the central nervous system and in the brain. They slowly kill brain cells and affect the deer that way. Definitely. It has a delayed incubation period, so once a deer gets CWD, it'll be about 18 months to 2 years before it actually starts to show signs of being visibly sick. But once that happens, there's been enough damage to the brain at that point that the deer goes downhill very quickly and dies.
Mm-hmm. And kind of follow up on that, you mentioned that there are delayed symptoms in chronic wasting disease. Is there anything like glaring that, would maybe point out that the deer has CWD? Like I know you mentioned it's not till the back end of the disease, but is there any obvious signs that a deer might have CWD?
So when it's, before clinical symptoms are visible, and most hunter-harvested deer that test positive for CWD are going to look perfectly healthy, and that's just because of that delayed incubation period. But if it's testing positive, that infectious agent, the misfolded proteins, are slowly degrading the brain of the deer. So just looking at a deer in the earlier stages of disease, you wouldn't know that it had CWD. When it gets to the later stages where the clinical symptoms are visible, then that's when rapid weight loss occurs. They'll head droop down, salivating, ears down. It just looks sick. Mm-hmm. So you couldn't just look at a deer that was in those clinical stages and automatically say that it was CWD. You could clearly tell there was something wrong with it, but it would take testing to confirm that. But before those clinical symptoms develop, for that first year and a half to 2 years, the deer are going to look. You wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at the deer.
And I didn't have this question written down, Jason, but like I said, the fact that these deer don't show symptoms till the disease has progressed, does that present any challenges to the Department of Conservation and tracking the cases of the disease, or does it present any challenges to you guys in that way?
Say it doesn't present challenges to us in terms of monitoring the disease, because we still collect a lot of samples from hunter-harvested deer, and so regardless of whether the deer is in a late clinical stage or early on, we still got the samples that are going to tell us where the location of the positive is. It does make it challenging from a communication standpoint, because folks in Missouri just do not see clinically infected CWD, deer clinically infected with CWD very often, just because the disease exists at a relatively low level in our state. And so sometimes that can be a challenge from a communication standpoint, because there are other diseases like hemorrhagic disease in deer populations that are very visible, and a lot of deer die in a very short period of time, and they see that. Whereas CWD, the dynamics of the disease are just very different. So it can be a challenge to communicate the severity of the disease and the potential that it holds to really affect our deer population adversely, even though folks aren't necessarily seeing those deer on the landscape.
Definitely, Jason. And could you explain how, some of the strategies of how the Missouri Department of Conservation is combating the spread of CWD? And if you wouldn't mind to explain how these strategies work.
Yeah, so when we think about CWD, I like to think about it in terms of like the two-pronged approach. One would be surveillance, the other would be management. So surveillance involves looking for the disease and then monitoring its distribution through time. So we collect last year over 37,000 CWD samples, most of which were hunter harvested. So that gives us a good idea of where the disease likely exists in the state, which is obviously important for management. So that's the surveillance side, is collecting samples. From a management side, way we look at it is at two different tiers in terms of spatial scale. So we have broad scale regulations, which would be, regulations at the county level. Things like within the CWD management zone, you can't put out feed or mineral for deer. You have to follow carcass movement restrictions. The antler point restriction, if it's in place, is not in place within the management zone. And you have some extra hunting opportunities too. So those management strategies are applied at that broad county level scale. But then we also have what we call localized management. So localized management would consist of what we call targeted removal. So if we have areas where we have known detections, we go in after the hunting season ends from mid-January to mid-March with landowner permission, and either our staff or the landowners, depending on their choosing, remove additional deer in addition to those that are removed by hunters during the hunting season to help slow the spread of the disease. And we also offer those folks in those smaller geographies, those CWD core areas as we call them, some additional hunting permits that they can use during the season as well.
Definitely. And Jason, would you say that these strategies have been successful? From my research, it seems like they have been compared to, other Midwestern states such as Tennessee, where some counties, I believe, had infection rates as high as 24%. I believe 90% of the counties in the CWD zone were less than 2% infection rate. So do you guys believe that you guys are handling this the right way? This is the most effective strategy?
I believe our management surveillance strategies have been very effective. I think in terms of our surveillance, we continue to find the disease at very low levels of infection. So if you can find the disease early where it exists, that certainly puts you in the driver's seat to be much more successful from a management standpoint. So our robust surveillance program has allowed us to find it early, so then we can put management on the ground as quickly as possible. And so, yes, I think for certain we've been successful at managing the disease. If you look at our infection rates or apparent prevalence rates, just the number of positives that we had divided by the total number of samples that we had, it's still really low. Even in our CW core areas, which are areas within 2 miles of a positive, last year only about 1% of the deer from those areas tested positive for the disease. So that's really encouraging, because we know from some trends in other states that once the percentage of the population that has the disease gets to be like 3 to 4 to 5%, then the rate accelerates really dramatically. And at that point in time, your management tools that you have to slow the spread become much more limited. So our approach is to manage the disease very aggressively early to keep the infection rates low enough that they don't hit that point where they just accelerate dramatically.
Mandatory sampling, yeah. If you could explain that process.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So each year in a subset of our CWD management zone counties, we have what we call mandatory CWD sampling. And so what that does is, this year happens to be in 43 of 114 counties. If you're in one of those counties and you shoot a deer on the opening weekend of the November portion, which is November 16 and 17, you have to take your deer or its head on the day of harvest to what we call a mandatory CWD sampling station. Mm-hmm. And so we've got resources on our website in the Fall Deer and Turkey booklet where you can see which counties that surveillance applies to and where the stations are located. So it just simply requires hunters in those counties on those 2 days to take their deer to one of those stations. We pull a CWD sample, and it's a great surveillance tool because we can collect a lot of samples in a short period of time. So during those 2 days, hunters harvest about a third of the deer that they'll harvest in the entire 4-month deer season. So we can typically collect around 20,000 samples in 2 days, which is a really efficient use of our time to be able to collect that many in that period of time. And that gives us a much better understanding of where the disease is located in the management zone, and also allows us to monitor the trends and spread through time in those counties.
Definitely. And just real quick to follow up on that too, I believe, and like you had mentioned, that Boone and Cole County, and I believe Audrain and Phelps County were just recently added to those mandatory counties this year, correct?
Yeah, so we had 18 new counties that were added to the management zone this year. And so those counties plus some other counties that we've done mandatory sampling in the past on are all grouped into that 43 county grouping that would be mandatory sampling. So yeah, there's quite a few counties here in central Missouri that will either have mandatory sampling for the very first time, or in the case of Boone, we've done it in the past, but it's been many years.
Definitely, Jason. Just a few more final questions here for you. And touch on one we had just discussed. Although the state did see an increase, I believe it was 9% increase in infection rates, in 2023. Overall, infection rates still remain low compared to other states. What does that mean to you as well as the Department of Conservation?
Yeah, so we did detect more cases of CWD last year than we had in previous years. And we did detect it in some new locations. So certainly we're seeing some spread of the disease, which is not unexpected. But I think it's really important to look at the prevalence rates, or what percentage of those samples are actually testing positive. And if we looked at the statewide scale last year of all the samples we collected, less than 0.5% tested positive. And if we looked at the deer that are within our core areas, which are within about 2 miles of positives, it was only 1%. So those rates are still really low. They're still at levels where we can, through active management, have a really positive impact on the trajectory of the disease, keep it at low levels, protect our deer herd, and ensure that the disease doesn't get to a point where it increases dramatically in that population. So even though we had more positives than we had in previous years, we're still in a very good place to continue our active management, to continue to slow that spread as much as we can to protect the deer population.
Definitely, Jason. And then, just two more final questions here for you. We had already discussed that one. So, how serious is preventing the spread of CWD? And is it something that could potentially have a big impact on Missouri's deer population if not managed properly?
Yeah, so CWD is an extreme threat to deer populations. I heard people, and I think they're correct, categorize it as one of the greatest conservation challenges of our time. Not even speaking about deer, but just conservation in general. Obviously, the whitetail population is an iconic population, iconic species that means so much to the citizens of Missouri and all across the country. And so it's a serious threat. We know from what we've seen in some other states, ones that have had the disease for a long time, they start to see a very high percentage of the deer population get infected, and some states are starting to see population declines that they've attributed to CWD. And so we know it's a very serious threat to our deer population, a very serious threat to our hunting culture, to our local economies that depend on hunting. On an annual basis, whitetail, we figured whitetails bring over $1 billion to our economy. We've got nearly 500,000 people that hunt them. It's a hunting culture that many people enjoy. And then if you're not a hunter, just enjoying watching whitetail. So that's all in jeopardy if CWD gains a strong foothold in our state. So it's a very serious issue, one that we are committed to working with landowners and hunters and the public to do everything we can to protect our herd from the disease.
Definitely, Jason. Then just lastly, sir, any additional information, anything important I may be leaving out here?
So I think in terms of this fall, if you're a deer hunter, some things to know is just to definitely take a look at our 2024 fall deer and turkey regulations booklet. As I mentioned, there are 18 new counties to the management zone, so folks in those counties, and a number of them are in central Missouri. So definitely look at the regulations book, understand what those regulations mean to you, and just to be prepared for the upcoming season. But I think, as a whole, as we near the start of the archery season, our deer population is very healthy. We have a lot of deer. They provide great hunting opportunities for almost 500,000 people and millions of pounds of venison. And so it's an exciting time of year. It's a cherished pastime, hunting heritage, and so I know we have a lot of hunters that are looking forward to going out in the woods, and wish everybody the best of luck this fall.
Definitely, Jason. And just to follow up, I believe, is your guys' regulation booklet, is that already on your guys' website?
Regulations booklet is out. It's on our website, and folks can also find it wherever they can get hunting permits, like at our offices and other places they would get hunting permits.
Definitely, Jason. Well, like I said, once again, really appreciate the time
Sure.
here today. So I really appreciate it.
Happy to.